Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm Janneke Ratcliffe, Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And I'm just really glad to welcome all of you to the call, those who are listening live, those listening to the recording in the future, and especially thank you to all our speakers, a really incredible lineup today. Before I jump in, a few notes of housekeeping. And here's some of them are on the slide here. The event is being recorded. The recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. Live captions are turned on. So to turn them off, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. All the participants are muted. Through the call, if you have questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box at any time. And we'll be sharing a link to a post-event survey and ask that you share your feedback with us. It's helpful for us and the panelists to hear what you are thinking about the event and what we can do in the future to shape these. And if you would like to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. So with those logistics behind us, again, thank you so much for joining us. And special gratitude to everybody who helped put on this important event, specifically the Prudential Foundation, who you will hear from next, as well as Mayor Baraka, the mayor of Newark, for participating and sharing the key challenges as well as solutions he has implemented in his city. I also want to recognize my colleague, Michael Neal, and the team he has led throughout this project for the research that helps to ground these important conversations. The Urban Institute has contributed significant analysis around homeownership disparities for households of color. However, our local research contribution to the broader effort that was already underway in Newark reminds us that the scope of the challenge and by extension, the suite of solutions needed can vary from place to place. For example, we know that nationwide, the majority of households own their primary residence, but also that there's a yawning 25 to 30 percentage point gap in home ownership rates between white households and Black and Hispanic households. In Newark, a city that is 85% Black or Hispanic, fewer than a quarter of households own their home, and the white, Black, and white Hispanic home ownership rate gaps are relatively small, less than 5 percentage points. This one point illustrates how Newark and other cities provide a lens through which to better understand the relationship between local communities and national outcomes and policies. I'm really looking forward to our speakers helping to do just that. And so now I will introduce Tiffany Jackson, Director of Inclusive Solutions at Prudential Financial.
Thank you so much, Janneke, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all in this virtual space for conversations on housing and housing equity. As Janneke mentioned, I'm Tiffany Jackson. I lead a strategic philanthropic portfolio at Prudential focused on driving inclusive economic growth, primarily in Prudential's headquarters city of Newark, New Jersey, a city in which I am proud to be born and raised. Prudential has been headquartered in Newark since 1875, so nearly 150 years now. Its founder, John Dryden, had a radical business idea at the time to offer life insurance protection to working families so they could have the same opportunity to achieve financial security as everyone else. That founding purpose of making financial security accessible for all remains the same at Prudential today. And it could not be more clear than in our commitment to Newark. We continue to invest in the city and its residents to help create economic and social opportunity and meaningful, lasting change. Our partnership with Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center has produced a series of research and local convenings to inform the development of effective policies and practices for addressing housing affordability and promoting equitable access to homeownership in Newark. When we entered this partnership with Urban in 2019, we had no idea of what was to come, a global pandemic, a national reckoning on race. And at the intersection of both, what was illuminated was the systemic inequities and structural barriers that Black and Hispanic people face in cities like Newark and all over the country. Today's symposium brings together practitioner organizations, elected officials, including the Mayor of Newark, Baraka, advocates and policymakers to explore solutions to achieving housing equity. Thank you all for being here today for this event. Thank you very much to Urban Institute for their great work. Much gratitude and appreciation to all of our panelists and presenters. And I'm very much looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany, so much for the collaboration through thick and thin, as you described, as well as your strong commitment to Newark and to equitable opportunities for households everywhere. Appreciate your being here. And now let us kick off our first panel. I'll turn it over to our moderator, Dan Hardcastle, a special assistant for the Office of the Secretary at HUD. Welcome, Dan, and thank you.
Hey, thank you, Janneke. So yes, at HUD, I'm in the Office of the Secretary, where I lead HUD's departmental strategic goal around promoting homeownership. I was also co-chair of the Policy and Guidance Workstream and the Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, or PAVE Task Force, which folks likely saw just released its action report in the last few weeks. I'm honored to be joined today by Mayor Baraka of Newark and Chad Maisel from the White House Domestic Policy Council. We're going to be talking about some of the really critical lessons learned in terms of local and federal policy support for Black and Hispanic homeownership in the pandemic crisis. One area that we, in talking with our panelists today before today's event about what some of the broad themes are, I think what we really coalesced around was this idea that the pandemic exacerbated the longstanding challenges faced for Black and Hispanic homeownership, but it also allowed for new thinking and new investigation of opportunities and thinking about both the local and federal level about how we can address some of these longstanding gaps in racial homeownership rates, as well as broader efforts to address the racial wealth gaps that are really deep and longstanding within these communities. So with that, I will go ahead and have our panelists come on. First, Mayor Baraka, and then Chad Maisel, Director of Racial and Economic Justice at the Domestic Policy Council, who is also involved in the PAVE effort and chaired the Education and Outreach Workstream. So welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Mayor, do you want to kick us off with some opening remarks?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Dan. I want to thank the Urban Institute for inviting me and having the foresight to put together a conference like this. Convening is very important to talk about home ownership and actually the racial wealth gap in New Jersey, as was talked about before we came on. New Jersey probably has one of the largest wealth gaps in the nation. The newest data that came out showed us that white families' median wealth was at $322,000, and African Americans were at about 17,000, and Hispanic or Latinos were at about 26. But what's more troubling than that, it pointed out that 1 in 5 households make below $35,000 annually, which is stark in what we're trying to do. And we know that that's mainly driven by home ownership and a consistent history of not bad choices, but bad policy and systemic barriers that were put in the way to prevent folks from owning homes and gaining wealth here in New Jersey, all over the country, but specifically in New Jersey, where we are. We know that those disparities are very stark because they live right next door to one another. In a county like Essex, for example, if you compare Newark to or East Orange or Irvington to surrounding cities less than 2 or 3 miles away, the income, the housing, all of those things are so wide that it is almost 2 different counties, in fact. So in Newark, we've been trying to address that in a myriad of different ways. One, I think we don't talk about a lot is raising people's opportunity to purchase, to buy, giving them larger salaries, making sure they have permanent jobs with growing income. We worked with our institutions here in the city, our anchor institutions, to hire 2,020 Newarkers. That number grew to 4,000. We have to continue to do that, make sure that we give people the opportunity to be able to buy homes, to purchase homes, to be in a position where that can happen. We at the same time try to take care of folks who are way below that, who are dealing with food insecurity and all kinds of other issues because of this, whether we're talking about the guaranteed income or opportunities to create cooperatives in the city. In terms of home ownership, we have used our land bank, which is the only land bank in the state, by the way, that was created. We use our land bank to kind of parcel together properties that the city can turn over to them, and they're able to do very innovative and creative things while keeping affordability or prices low. We were able to take a few of our residents who were in public housing. We took their Section 8 voucher and created a tool which enabled them to buy a mortgage or be a homeowner for the first time in the city, and we could depress the cost of that mortgage because the city owns the property. We actually get local Black and brown developers to develop the property. So we give them the opportunity to earn, but we put people in housing using a home using a Section 8 voucher, and they can own the home outright in just 15 years. This is a project that we're continuously going to expand upon and grow in the city. It turned out well for us, and we want to continue to invest in that, and we have been at the same time. There are basic other kind of opportunities that we create in terms of first-time homeowners, opportunities in the city to give people down payments to purchase homes, because usually that's the part of it. The capital is not there in the front, so we create opportunities for them to do that. We're also working on creating more cooperatives. Co-ops in terms of home ownership in the city, which I think is incredibly important, particularly because the developers are not really interested in developing co-ops in a market like this. They get more money for rental housing, which is why Newark is more than 70% renters. And during the pandemic, it showed that our housing crisis created a kind of petri dish for COVID-19 to spread all over the city very rapidly. But we're going to use Invest Newark, our development arm in the city, and partner with local nonprofits to begin to develop home ownership through building cooperatives in the downtown and the surrounding downtown area, and work with organizations like the Urban League, which we've been doing, to give them kind of gap funding and financing to be able to build more homes in communities like Fairmont, so we can encourage people to buy homes in the city of Newark, move away from speculation, and begin to invest in property ownership in the city. We are laser-like focused on that. We and very deliberate and intentional in making sure that we put investment in home ownership, particularly home ownership for local residents, local Black and brown residents in our city. There's a lot more to talk about, but I'll save some time for Chad.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor. Chad, do you want to talk about some of the federal response around the pandemic and some of our broader efforts around the homeownership?
Sure. Yeah, that was great, though. I could have listened to that for a while. Really exciting stuff. And thanks for the intro, Dan. So really thrilled to be here. Glad to be speaking with you all. I'm actually, especially a New Jersey themed event. I'm a very proud New Jerseyan, and we'll talk about it to anyone who will listen. Grew up going to the Jersey Shore. Before this current role I'm in at the White House, was working for Senator Booker in Washington for several years, and actually spent 2019 as Mayor Baraka's constituent in Newark, and just loved it. So thrilled to be here. I'm currently at the White House Domestic Policy Council, where I work on a kind of wide-ranging set of issues, primarily focused on helping people build wealth. So issues around home ownership, entrepreneurship, federal procurement, access to financial services, and others. I also helped lead, as Dan touched on and was also very involved. I also helped lead what's known as the PAVE Task Force, which was the interagency effort that President Biden launched last June chaired by Secretary Fudge and Ambassador Rice, my boss, to root out bias in home appraisals. So listen, in his first days in office, many of you all know the president signed a presidential memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. This action, one, it directed HUD to take certain actions to advance fair housing policies. But it also, importantly, and Mayor Baraka touched on this, it owned the federal government's role in systematically supporting discrimination and exclusion in housing and mortgage lending. So that came on top of the president's day one equity executive order, which he put out again in his first day in office, and it directed every federal agency across the whole of the federal government to addressing the lasting impacts of systemic racism on communities of color and other communities. Every single federal agency, from HUD to HHS to the Pentagon and everyone in between, has since submitted a plan with concrete steps and actions that they're taking to lower barriers to entry and increase access to its programs and its services. And of note, those plans will actually be rolled out later this week. So stay tuned for that. Many of my colleagues at Domestic Policy Council have been working very hard on that, along with many people across the federal government. So as this group knows very, very well, the pandemic, like the housing crisis in 2009 and 10, showed the precarity of wealth with particularly acute and devastating impacts on people and communities of color. When we think about the racial wealth gap, we know that homeownership is a major driver. It was a DEMO study, I believe, it found that eliminating racial disparities in the rates of homeownership would shrink the wealth gap between Black and white and Latino and white households by about 30%, and that eliminating the racial disparities in the amount of wealth families gain from owning a home. In other words, the returns that folks are able to obtain as a result of that investment in homeownership, equalizing those would narrow the gap by 16% between Black and white households and by an additional 41% between Latino and white households. And, I should say, I know we're focused on homeownership today in talking about the economic impacts of the pandemic, especially as it relates to wealth. The small business story is just crucial as well. Many Black and Latino households derive their wealth from entrepreneurship and small business ownership. And, as the mayor and others know, they were hit just especially hard by the pandemic. I was on the Hill, as I said before, at the start of the pandemic, working as a Senate staffer. And, I just remember hearing constantly from New Jersey small business owners and, the challenges they were facing, in particular, how they weren't able to access what was at the time very generous funding that was designed to keep them afloat. But because of the way it was designed and the way it was implemented, they weren't able to. They were not able to access the Paycheck Protection Program. Maybe they didn't have a relationship with a mainstream bank. The funding ran out too quickly, and they were a small business and didn't know how to navigate the process. Whatever it may be, we lost a lot of businesses as a result of how that program was designed, and really importantly, how it was actually implemented. So, policy matters and policy implementation matters, of course, as this group knows very well. And on the small business side, that has big impacts on the racial wealth gap as well. Our kind of in-house the Council of Economic Advisors, the White House, they did some analysis recently, and they found that if the rates and returns of small business ownership was equalized across white and Black business owners, that would narrow the racial wealth gap by about 14%. So from the outset, the main priority from the outset of the pandemic, the main priority of President Biden and many of my colleagues, including Erica Pothig, who is a former urban alum, who many of you all know, who leads the housing portfolio at the White House, that their main priority, our main priority, has been helping people hold on to their assets and retain existing wealth. First and foremost, we work to keep homeowners housed. The $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan was truly historic, helped keep millions of renters and homeowners in their homes. We moved quickly to exercise executive action in addition to the new funding through the ARP We worked across government to align efforts to minimize disruption and really maximize impact for homeowners. Those policies prevented foreclosures and allowed some homeowners with government-backed loans to pause their mortgage payments for up to 18 months. And nearly around 7 million American households took advantage of forbearance options. Back in June of last year, we also announced substantial payment reduction options for borrowers with government-backed and guaranteed mortgages. I imagine we'll be talking more about some of these interventions later today. Looking ahead, we've put forward an ambitious agenda to boost housing supply and lower barriers to entry through down payment assistance, through legislation, which we continue to fight for on the Hill, while at the same time seeking to maximize, again, administrative and executive authorities that do not require action by Congress. Finally, I'll note we've taken action, and Dan talked about this, and HUD has been a terrific partner and leader in this space. We've taken action to address persistent misvaluation of homes in communities of color and owned by people of color, which can have a major impact on the extent to which people are able to fully realize the financial returns associated with owning a home, especially through refinance and, in addition to potentially selling. Last June 1st, 2021, the president was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, commemorating the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he launched what was a first of its kind interagency initiative, charging the entire federal government with doing everything it can to root out bias in the appraisal process and advance more equitable home valuation. So last month, we actually rolled out our action plan. I urge you to check it out at pave.hud.gov. Just a terrific website with a set of about 20 actions that we are taking as a federal government across multiple agencies, both cabinet agencies and independent agencies, to root out bias, with interventions ranging from diversifying and better training the appraiser workforce to taking concrete steps through rulemaking to prevent algorithmic bias in home valuations, to better aligning and kind of syncing up our data and research capabilities so that we can better identify patterns of bias and where we need to pursue enforcement. Again, nearly all of these steps can be taken without congressional action. So, of course, with all these efforts, from implementation of ARP to the more recent work on home appraisals, the coordination between federal, state, and city officials has been critical. As we look ahead, we know that much of the most innovative and creative work to narrow the racial wealth gap and boost homeownership will happen at the local level. So I'm just, really thrilled to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Chad. I'll start with some discussion between the three of us before moving to a Q&A from the audience. Mayor, to kick us off, obviously many of the homeownership challenges that you just talked through in Newark are, decades in the making. When the pandemic arrived, how did that shift your focus and priorities when it came to housing challenges in Newark?
Well, first and foremost, we had to do exactly what the federal government was intending and sending us money to be able to get done, which was make sure that folks had the opportunity to pay their rent, particularly in a city where the majority of the folks, the overwhelming majority, are renters. We gave out millions of dollars to residents to make sure that they were able to stay in their homes, which in turn helped homeowners not foreclose on their property. We also, worked along with the state government to be able to make sure homeowners had access to opportunities to have forbearance, but also pay their mortgage at the same time. We did that immediately. And I think some of the thinking that happened around that time was to begin to pivot in terms of housing and a sense of urgency around it, making sure that we build enough affordability so people can, in fact, be able to have a place to stay, right? So we focused a lot more on trying to create more affordable options for folks and still pushing the overall agenda of creating home ownership at the same time. But we had to expedite that. And with the help of the Equitable Growth Commission that we've created in the city, and a climate report in Rutgers coming out, really defining how inequitable the situation was and how much of a deficit we had in affordable housing. It gave us a greater sense of urgency to build more affordable housing as quickly as we could, which helped us strengthen the inclusionary zoning ordinance that require people to build affordability, to put more money in our affordable housing trust fund that we in fact use for gap funding or gap financing and to create affordable housing in other parts of the city, but also affordable home ownership. At the same time, that same fund will be used to keep mortgages low. Same fund used to create co-ops, help create co-ops in the community. So we've been working on these issues for a long time prior to COVID, but I think what COVID did is create a sense of urgency that these things needed to happen immediately.
Chad, a similar question. We know that the racial wealth gap is one that's been growing for decades, and the pandemic just put even greater pressure on households of color. So throughout the pandemic, how did the administration seek to help people of color build and retain wealth?
Sure. Thanks for that. So, I'll start with the housing piece. Much of the administration's efforts were really informed by the housing crisis of 2009 and 2010, and which really reinforced the need to act swiftly and as boldly as possible. So shortly after taking office, we used executive actions and ARP resources to keep homeowners housed. HUD, USDA, and VA, they extended their foreclosure moratoria, extended that from CARES Act. And CFPB later issued a rule that effectively banned mortgage servicers through December of 2021, with just a few exceptions. So those policies, were quite effective in preventing foreclosures, and they allowed homeowners with government-backed loans to pause their mortgage payments for as much as a year and a half. In addition, late last June, the administration announced substantial, pretty significant payment reduction options for borrowers with government-backed and guaranteed mortgages. Again, I think this was informed by what didn't necessarily work in the past, especially looking back over a decade ago when so much housing wealth was lost in the housing crisis. Rather than being incremental this time around, we provided homeowners with a roughly 25% reduction in monthly principal and interest payments. This allowed them to ensure they could, really afford to remain in their homes and build equity long term. Countless borrowers are seeing the benefit of those policies as they've modified their mortgages and again, stayed in their homes and built equity. Now, also note the ARP included a $10 billion homeowner assistance fund. Those dollars can be used for assistance with not just mortgage payments, but homeowners insurance, utilities, and other purposes. I understand that that funds portal is up and running in New Jersey and available. Now, Dan, you asked about kind of wealth building more generally. I'll again kind of revisit the story around small business quickly. With the Paycheck Protection Program, which offered loan forgiveness for loans to small businesses, they held on to their workers. We heard and from so many people who were not able to access those funds, and so when we did, when the Biden administration came in, we pursued a number of administrative changes to the program to help ensure that the smallest of the small businesses were able to access those dollars. For example, we created a 2-week window where only businesses with 20 or less employees were able to access those dollars. We also modified the calculation so that sole props, again, mostly people, which are mostly people of color, or disproportionately people of color, were able to maximize their the assistance they were able to receive. And that just had a massive impact. There have been a couple academic studies that have been released since that have just shown how much more targeted the Paycheck Protection Program outlays were, in this latest tranche when we were able to design with the smallest of the small businesses in mind.
Mayor Chad, mentioned some broader wealth building efforts, and you mentioned it as well that you think about wealth building more broadly than just helping folks into homeownership. Can you talk a little bit more about how else you have helped Newark's renters build wealth? Okay, you're on mute, Mayor.
Sorry about that. Absolutely. I spoke earlier about making sure that we raised people's income, their salary. That's incredibly important. And a lot of times when we talk about housing, we do not talk about wages and people's income. The fact that 1 in 5 households, African-American households in Newark make under $35,000 a year is problematic and criminal. And we have to raise the wages. And so our kind of discussion with the anchor institutions in Newark is how to do that, how to make sure we are employing more Newark residents. How do we make sure that they're making wages that are living wages? How do we incorporate all of the private sector and public sector jobs that are here to make sure that they're paying living wages to our residents and lift the wages on the one end? Secondly, we're creating more business opportunity for Newarkers using our Invest Newark arm, creating opportunities for people to open up business, to expand business, to start business, to incubate business. We created a fund that helps Black and brown businesses specifically to open up new businesses and to expand their businesses in the city of Newark. When we did our lead service line replacement, we wrote in the contractual language that they had to make sure they subcontracted with African-American and Latino and local businesses here in the city of Newark in the contract, not just the affirmative action policy, but right in the contracts. We then created a low interest kind of loan for businesses and forgivable loans for businesses in some instances where they got up to $200,000, $250,000 so they can deal with their balance sheet, take care of capital costs so they can in fact participate in that replacement program. And some of those businesses are now primaries on projects throughout the state of New Jersey. And it was a very intricate process we put together. And we continuously use that. We teach them how to bond. We give them the opportunity to get loans and how to access contracts on the city and county level. And so we're pushing that, as widely as we can. And there are many people who have taken advantage of that in the city of Newark.
Perfect. You've talked a lot about the role that anchor institutions play for you all in the city. Do you feel like that's a unique asset that Newark has, given the Prudentials and other longstanding corporations there? And what else besides that do you think Newark uniquely has that they can bring to this effort?
Well, I think we have a lot. I don't know if it's unique. I mean, many places have anchor institutions, and I think we have an anchor. The difference is we have an anchor collaborative, and we have a Newark Alliance and folks that are organized collectively to use their skill and force to leverage the kind of things that we're trying to leverage here in the city of Newark. So when we come together with a jobs program, a 2020 jobs program, that all of the anchors make a concerted effort to identify, hire Newark residents. 2,000 jumps to 4,000, and anchors anywhere from the hospitals to Rutgers University to Prudential to United Airlines. All of these people begin to behave as anchors. So it's one thing to be an anchor, it's another thing to behave as an anchor. And so when they do that, and then also move into procurement. So prior to that, most of these businesses, their procurement strategies were non-existent. About 3% of their spend was in Newark, New Jersey. And Prudential financed a study that was done that said if they just raise that procurement level to about 10%, you're talking about tens of millions of dollars that will be let loose in the economy here in the city of Newark. And so we've been working collectively to raise the spend in the city of Newark, not just through the anchors, but through our behavior as city government and other people's behavior, county government and other people's behavior as well, to deliberately and intentionally purchase goods and services from Newark residents, particularly Black and brown folks, to help grow the economy and put more wealth in the hands of residents here.
Yeah, both you and great, Jeff.
Oh, I was going to piggyback on the procurement work.
I was going to send that to you. So go for it.
Okay. So this is something we've been thinking just a ton about and feel really passionately about, across the administration, something I'm working a lot on. The federal government spends about, and this number is just astonishing, about $650 billion every year on goods and services, everything from pencils to medical devices to elevator services and IT and everything in between. Typically, we spend about 10% of our, if you look back in previous years, about 10% of those dollars go to small disadvantaged businesses, which include minority-owned businesses. And the president has set a goal of moving to increasing that number by 50%, so up to 15% by 2025. And we're already seeing, as a result of some concrete policy changes and new management efforts at the agency level, really significant progress towards that goal. And we expect that if we do meet that goal, gradually from 10 to 15% between now and 2025, we'll see about $100 billion additional to minority-owned businesses in just that 5-year period. So this is real money. It's about using, as Mayor Baraka noted, this is about using the purchasing power that we have to advance better and more equitable outcomes and help more communities, especially those who have been shut out for a long time, really help them build wealth.
Perfect. So we've started to hear from a couple of questions regarding these homeownership initiatives that, Mayor, that you've undertaken with your voucher programs, and that's, of course, at the national level, that's something that HUD is very interested in. Is we do have this ability in a limited number of jurisdictions to use housing choice vouchers for homeownership, but there are challenges and the use has been rather limited around the country. So we'd be curious to hear about that effort that you all have led there.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Sorry, the use of vouchers for homeownership.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, the Section 8 voucher is something that HUD gives to folks. And what we've been able to do with the help of NACA, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot more later, create an instrument that allowed us to use the voucher, in fact, to pay the mortgage and taxes for folks over a 15-year period. We were able to create this through that organization to create a mortgage that was useful. But I think the beginning part of it is what enabled us to do it, which is we own the property, right? The city owns the property, depressed vacant property in the city. We RFP to local Black and brown developers to begin to develop these homes and build these homes. And it allows us to dictate almost what the home is actually sold for. So we can keep the selling price low, which allows us to create a mortgage tool, that allow folks to go into this property and pay their mortgage outright in 15 years. And because we have control over the asset itself, it gives us more flexibility to do the things that we want to do. And using the Invest Newark and the land bank, it gives us more latitude outside of city government to do specific projects such as that. We are, in fact, getting more investment from private folks who are interested in helping us further this goal. And we're looking for that. And I saw a question about how do we attract money? We usually use our CDBG dollars that we get from the federal government, home dollars that we get from the federal government, and local CDFIs that are here, and partner with them and local nonprofits to get this done. Because usually some of this work, deliberate and intentional work, is not being taken on by larger developers and huge financial institutions. This is work that has to be done by mid-sized to small lending institutions. And with the money and resources that we have on a local level that we get from federal and state entities. and begin to partner with our nonprofits to get projects like this done.
Perfect. Well, again, it's great to see what you all are piloting there as we look at how we can make better use of that program in other communities around the country. You've also talked a lot about the role of co-ops in Newark and the need to emphasize those. Can you, for folks who don't know as much about the role that co-ops can play in a housing ecosystem, can you talk about their importance in Newark?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in cities that might be landlocked, that might not have a lot of space in terms of just building rows and rows of housing. We actually have opportunity to do both because we have a lot of vacant properties in depressed areas in the city of Newark. There's also opportunities for us to build co-ops and invest in them and keep them affordable so that it's home ownership in buildings that might have traditionally been rental spaces to either redevelop them or repurpose them or build from the ground new buildings where folks can own the property collectively and own their unit outright. And these are things that we're working on immediately, and I think is incredibly important for places like Newark, where we're getting a lot of young people who are also coming in, who are graduating here now from Newark, going to Rutgers University, IT, and working and want to come back to the city and begin to engage in the economy and live here in this community. And so a lot of folks might not want to rent. We want to create an opportunity for them to own in our downtown and surrounding downtown area. But it's also a tool that we can use for families who, to get rid of the kind of density that happens in other communities and other areas, something that we saw during COVID, to create more space and opportunity for folks to create buildings that are cooperative, to give them an opportunity to own that at the same time. And in some instances, a lot cheaper for us to do in that way.
I know that from HUD that, innovative homeownership and shared equity models like co-ops and community land trusts are really part of how we're thinking about how we can, further homeownership. Chad, as we emerge from the pandemic and the president has laid out this agenda to build back better, can you talk through some of the broader administration priorities to boost homeownership among Black and Latino households?
Yeah, sure, of course. So, as everyone here knows, rents in many communities have skyrocketed and homeownership has become increasingly out of reach. And so, first I'll say that the administration feels strongly about the urgent need to address the mismatch between supply and demand, and work to boost the supply of housing that is safe and affordable in every community. Addressing this challenge, of boosting supply would have a range of positive impacts: more housing close to good jobs and good transportation options, less inflation, segregation, climate pollution. And so, we've proposed significant housing resource to expand access to home ownership that were ultimately included in the House-passed version of the Build Back Better bill, including tax credits and subsidies to boost supply, and incentives for land use reforms at the state and local level, among other programs. Build Back Better also included a new $10 billion first generation homebuyer down payment assistance program, which we know would, be particularly impactful and disproportionately benefiting people of color. Now, of course, the legislative landscape is uncertain, as always. We're staying at it and pushing to get as many of these provisions as we can across the finish line in this Congress. The bipartisan neighborhood homes investment tax credit, which was part of the president's American Jobs Plan and Build Back Better vision, for example, continues to gain, bipartisan co-sponsors and support on the Hill. Concurrent to those legislative negotiations and conversations that are happening, we're looking at all available administrative tools and levers at our disposal to boost supply, increase affordability, and otherwise just bring home ownership within reach to more folks.
Mayor, you mentioned the challenges that Newark faces as a landlocked city in terms of creating new homeownership opportunity. How do you all, given the legacy of redlining and of historic disinvestment in many of these neighborhoods, how do you think about promoting homeownership in those neighborhoods at the same time as you are trying to help residents achieve greater opportunity and reach areas of opportunity?
Yep. And it's a very difficult task because you have to deal with the immediate needs of folks right away, which is the need to feed their family, to have a decent place to live, to make sure that the rents are not rising at rates that are untenable. And so we have to invest in those things in the right now and create opportunities around food insecurity to address that immediately. But on the other side, create an environment that's conducive to home ownership. And we begin to do that through the land bank. And as you said, creating land trusts, we identify areas in the city. And we get that land that the city owns into the land bank, and they're able to do creative things with those properties. We allow homeowners to add on to their property through side lots, or begin to create opportunities for home ownership or for local developers to build homes at specific costs and attract Newark residents and developers into those homes specifically. It gives us the opportunity to do that because, as I said in the beginning, we own the property and the land, which means that we can sell it at the price that we think is reasonable and get local developers to develop that. So we're really dealing with two issues at the same time. We're putting money in local developers' pockets to expand their business and opportunity, at the same time creating low-cost mortgages and home ownership for residents of the city to purchase homes. And it has to be a very deliberate process. And I keep saying that because developers are not going to actively go into these communities because the market does not suggest that they be there. They can't get the rents that they desire to get based on the building costs in New Jersey. So it keeps them from these areas. And banks specifically won't give people loans to develop in these areas either. So that is a whole nother issue of discrimination that we have to tackle. And so it means that we have to use local CDFIs. We have to use groups like Invest Newark, these kind of development arms that the city has, the Housing Authority, which is another development arm the city has, the Parking Authority, to use these to partner with local nonprofit organizations like the Urban League, like La Casa de Don Pedro, those kind of organizations to help us build the kind of housing stock we're looking for and identify, and even help us identify folks that go in that housing. And as the Urban League does, they even give training programs for first-time home buyers to go into the property and teach them how to, deal with it financially and pay their mortgage and all these other specific things that are associated with home ownership. So it has to be a full kind of breadth program that entails everything, and it has to be done deliberately. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of attention.
Chad, obviously in talking about redlining, and the federal government's historic role there, that was certainly, one of the impetuses behind, the president's charge to launch the PAVE task force last year. Can you talk a little bit more about, what was included in our final report and how you see that playing into some of the issues we discussed today?
Yeah. So I think many people certainly who are tuning in here know this issue, but as many of you all may have been exposed through press accounts where you'll hear about often Black families who are looking to refinance or sell their homes. They have their home, an appraiser come in to offer evaluation or an appraisal. It kind of feels low. So then they'll order a reappraisal, ask for another appraisal. But this time they'll maybe take down family photos, or they'll have a white friend or someone stand in for them. And these press accounts, have, shared that, in that second appraisal, it will often go up $50,000, $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 relative to the first appraisal. With pretty significant impacts on the ability to enjoy the full financial returns associated with home ownership. We actually, I'll get to what we're actually doing in a second, but I mean, just on the extent of this, Fannie and Freddie recently did a couple studies that really showed that these aren't just one-off stories or anecdotes. A Freddie study that was released back in September of last year, it found that appraisals for home purchases in majority Black and majority Latino neighborhoods were about twice as likely to result in a value, like an appraisal, below the actual contract price compared to appraisals in predominantly white neighborhoods. So this is compared to a contract price, what someone's willing to pay for it. Again, twice as likely to come in under that number. Similarly in the refinance context, there was a Fannie study just this year, and it found that overvaluations of white-owned homes were much more common than overvaluations in Black-owned homes or homes in majority Black neighborhoods. And so, we're seeing these patterns of misvaluations of homes owned by or in communities of color. I was fortunate to have kind of a front row seat to just the incredible work that was done across the federal agencies to seek to address it. So one item that, I spent a lot of time on is on the appraiser workforce. The BLS has shown that about 97% of the appraiser workforce is white. Similarly, no appraisers are not required to have fair housing and fair lending, anti-bias training in order to become an appraiser. So one of the sets of actions that we laid out in the action plan that we put out was, one, recommendations around lowering the barriers to entry, which are extraordinarily high and especially burdensome for underrepresented communities and people. So make it easier for them to become an appraiser. We don't think you need a college degree, for example, and to become an appraiser. There's been no evidence suggesting that it makes you more successful or effective as an appraiser. And also requiring appraisers to, if they're going to perform appraisals for federal transactions, for the VA or USDA and so on, FHA, they need to get trained, fair housing, fair lending training. We've made a series of commitments around aligning our data. We have great data across the federal government. Of course, it's all fragmented and siloed and no one talks to each other. And there's lots of reasons for that, of course. But there's a real commitment to moving towards an aggregated database that will better allow us to identify patterns of bias and misvaluation, identify specific appraisers that may be, systemically and continuously offering misvaluations of homes owned by people of color, and other trends, for example, in rural and in tribal areas. Just a ton of work in this space. It's an area to kind of keep an eye on because the administration is, while we released an action plan last month, we are fully committed to continuing the work. We see that work as a milestone, not a capstone. And we're really interested in engaging, including hopefully with many of the folks who are listening today, to identify really concrete solutions to what we see as a really important challenge that needs to be addressed.
Mayor, have you seen challenges on the ground with home appraisals, either in terms of the over or undervaluation or the issues that those compose in your communities?
Well, that's always been a historic issue in the city in terms of appraisals and insurance as well. Just being able to insure your home and what the insurance agencies are charging you more money for home insurance for probably the same kind of property that you would buy in another community. All of those things have been historic and systemic in our community. Our property values are increasing in the city, though, because of increased development that is taking place in our community. So that is happening in the immediate sense. But there's always been a historic issue around appraised value of property in the city. And most of the institutions that have to help people get into homes.
We'll note we're in our last 10 minutes, and so we've been trying to weave in some of the questions that have come in through the chat. But if anybody does have questions that you've not provided yet, please put those into the Q&A section, and we'll make sure to touch on them. Mayor, you mentioned the increasing home prices that you've seen. Has that created any challenges for your homeownership efforts in Newark?
Not in terms of what we're doing, because most of the things that we're doing are based on properties that the city have and own, and we can regulate the prices of those. Obviously, some of the capacity challenges we have is always around resources. How much capital does the city have to invest in projects such as this? How many people are willing to partner with us to do the projects that we're trying to get done? And how many can we do based on the capacity of the mid-sized developers who are willing to do this at the rate that we need it done at, right? So just the speed of getting these things done. So we may be able to build 5, 6, 7, half a dozen or a dozen of homes, but we need to be able to double and triple that, and that means we need more capacity as it relates to resources and in terms of developers and lending institutions, CDFI lending institutions.
I see a question come in about Fannie Mae appraisal guidelines, and obviously, through the PAVE task force, we had the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which oversees Fannie and Freddie, participating, and certainly they put forth a number of commitments there. But I would also note that last fall, HUD signed a historic memorandum of understanding with FHFA, the GSEs, to increase our fair housing and fair lending enforcement around their actions. And so it is something that we recognize that both within HUD's FHA programs, but then with HUD's role in fair housing enforcement more broadly, that it's critical that we identify opportunities to ensure that GSE policies are aligned and moving forward these areas. Got a question come in about CDFIs, and Mayor, you've talked about the role that local lenders and how critical they have been in your efforts there, as well as with the Newark Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Can you talk a little bit about what the affordable housing development infrastructure looks like within Newark on the financial side?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we get the direct funding from federal and sources. Through home and CDBG and all of those dollars that we use very intentionally. There's also state opportunity through tax credits that allow us to develop affordability in properties. And in order to get resources from the state, you have to have a level of affordability in it. So that's a part of what we use as well. The Affordable Housing Trust Fund is monies that we get from developers who also get resources from the city. They have to pay into Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And as it relates to our inclusionary zoning ordinance, in some instances, we allow folks to pay into Affordable Housing Trust Fund when the finances don't work out for them to put all of the affordability on site. We obviously want them to put it on site, but we know that just having people build the housing on site is not going to allow us to reach our goal at the rate we need to. So we need to be able to put money in a trust fund that helps us invest in other projects that are doing more than 20% affordability in their property, that may be doing 50, 60, 70% affordability, or to do creative things like home ownership and co-op ownership. We need to have the kind of capital to be able to do that and invest in those projects. So that's basically the extent of it, and partnering again with our nonprofits who have other tools to build housing in a community and help them get that done through tax incentives and our opportunity to pay into their project through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund.
Chad, is in terms of the administration's efforts around small business support, are CDFIs a part of your thinking there?
Yeah. Please.
From you too, Mayor, we welcome that. Yeah.
No, you go ahead, Chad. I'll piggyback off what you're saying. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'll be quick. Yeah. So certainly, and the Vice President Harris has been a real leader in this space and is really passionate, dating back to her time in the Senate, and was back in December announced about $9 billion in support for direct support for CDFIs, which was provided for in one of the one of the COVID relief bills back in December 2020, with much more to come on that front. Relatedly, there are a couple other programs that are soon to be coming down the pike. The first is the State Small Business Credit Initiative, which is a $10 billion program that's going to push capital to states and territories to set up not just debt, but also equity programs, growth capital for small businesses. And importantly, really, really importantly, I think we've learned from previous experiences and what has worked and what hasn't worked. And we have $300 million devoted to technical assistance to provide the kind of financial and legal assistance so that small businesses can actually access those benefits. And we're not just shoveling more resources to folks who don't really need it, who are already well positioned to get them. So that's another area to kind of keep an eye on. That's a Treasury program, again, State Small Business Credit Initiative, and those plans have been submitted, and funding should start flowing soon.
Yep. So two things I want to add on to that is one, Invest Newark is our number one arm that we use, almost like a CDFI, to begin to invest in these small businesses and give them the technical support they need and the training that they need at the same time to start up and grow and sustain their business. New Jersey Community Capital also does a great job in the city of Newark, helping us in terms of development as a CDFI in the city and CAPC as well. So we try to work with these organizations, and the Urban League, also operates as a developer in the city. So, in some instances they do dual kind of things. But one thing I want to say that is incredibly important that I didn't mention was how valuable the housing authority is in terms of the housing authority is the number one landowner in the city. They own more land than anybody else in the city. Many of those housing properties are closed and they're abandoned. And that is one of the first places that we can use to begin to create affordable housing that we need. And so the kind of policies that come out of HUD become extremely important to figure out how do we put those properties back online in a way that it doesn't resemble what the experiment that took, because that's what it was, an experiment that took place prior to that had to be, raised to create the kind of scatter site housing and all this other kind of thing. How do we begin to invest in housing in a way that it leads to home ownership and creating opportunities for low-cost home ownership, as well as rental properties? And I think the Housing Authority of HUD should begin, if I'm not mistaken, I think some of the newer policies have been geared towards that, but begin to invest in these communities like Newark that have a myriad of properties that are just not developed at all.
Terrific. Well, we're at time, but I want to thank both of you for joining me this morning. Obviously, this is such a hugely important area of focus, both at the local and federal level, and it's just really been an honor to help moderate this discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to our next panel, which will be focused on comparing and contrasting the Black and Hispanic homeownership challenge in key cities that are comparable to Newark. And that's headed up by Chanel Zeisel.
Hey everyone, it's wonderful to see y'all. My name is Chanel Zeisel. I am the Assistant Director at the Office of Housing and Community Development here in the great city of Atlanta, where it is already definitely pollen season. So if you hear me sneezing, I apologize. I am like having the worst allergies. But I'm really excited to, be moderating this panel today. I think we have a great discussion lined up for y'all. We have three amazing panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves. They are Jerrah Crowder, who is the Assistant Director of Economic and Housing Development in Newark, New Jersey. So we've got some continuation here. Hi, Jerrah, how are you?
How are you? Good afternoon. A pleasure to be here with you all. Excited to talk about what's going on here in Newark. I think Mayor Baraka teed it up quite well. I'm excited to even expand on a lot of things that he brought up, because under his leadership, there's so much more as opposed to what he was able to discuss. So I hope to be able to discuss a lot more of that and be as helpful as possible to the panel and the audience today. So great to be here with you.
Wonderful. And we also have Terri Lee. She is our Chief Operating Officer here at the Atlanta Housing Authority. Terri, are you with us? I see that she's on, but I think she's on mute. We'll circle back. We also have Sharon Park. She's the Executive Director of Developing Affordable Starter Homes Fund out in Baltimore. Hey, Sharon.
Hey, how are you? Good afternoon, everyone.
Welcome. So I'm sure, I know I'm well familiar with Terri's schedule because we work together closely, so I'm sure she'll be joining us in just a moment. So why don't we just jump in and have y'all just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work, and maybe a little bit about the history and the current state of Black home ownership in your community and your current connection or past connection to this initiative. Do you want to, yeah, I'll let you lead us out, Jerrah.
Yeah, thanks. Just first and foremost, want to begin by thanking the Urban Institute and Prudential for hosting this symposium and giving us an opportunity to kind of come on and talk about what it is that we do. And hopefully this will turn into some great knowledge sharing. We can both learn from those on, as well as provide valuable information in order to continue the discussions in order to make a even greater impact in our communities. So as you mentioned, my name is Jerrah Crowder. I currently serve as the Assistant Director here at the City of Newark's Department of Economic and Housing Development. Just prior to jumping into this role, I was a manager for the Office of Affordability and Sustainable Housing here in Newark. That's one of the innovations under our mayor, Baraka, as we look to provide innovative and creative responses to some of the longstanding challenges of affordable housing. Here in the city of Newark, we say, we like to say Newark is a city where we have a 22% homeowners. We like to lead with that, but that also means that 78% of our folks are renters. And so, as we take a look at such a large population of renters, Newark is also a majority minority city, right? So when we talk about Newark, we're not necessarily forced to kind of add the caveat of whether or not populations are Black or Hispanic, as the vast majority of our population is. And so the interventions that we come up with, our work tend to be focused on those populations by default. And so like what we've done is really follow our mayor's lead. I just want to step back for a quick second. Mayor Baraka established a Newark Forward framework, if you will. And under that framework, we are laser focused on equitable development, right? So as the city of Newark grows, so must the most vulnerable of our residents grow and be involved in that prosperity and that growth as well. And so out of that, there's a whole ecosystem, if you will, of initiatives, interventions, and programs in order to make sure that happens. And out of that, there are some specific initiatives that focus on promoting home ownership. The mayor named one major asset, which is the land bank, which really speaks to his leadership in terms because it required leadership on a state level to get involved initially to establish a land bank. And as we know, something that's key in terms of determining affordability is our land costs. And so it's a tremendous asset that we've been able to be quite intentional about in terms of how land is disposed, who is disposed to, and how that helps drive our goals as far as home ownership is concerned. the mayor teed up a lot of things. I could literally speak to you all day about these, but so it's not necessarily one initiative or one thing. The mayor said, particularly during this recent public health crisis, is that Newark's prescription is not necessarily everyone else's prescription. And the same applies to how we go about promoting home ownership. And so one of the things that he did was he established housing goals here. And so, there was a large stakeholder group of housing experts here in the city and community leaders who came together to really help establish these goals. And so, within these 5 goals, one is explicit about home ownership. And so I just kind of look forward to talking about what that means and the metrics and how we're implementing that. But as you've heard from the mayor, and you've just heard a little bit from me in terms of, again, the intentional, thoughtful approach as we focus on equity and really promoting home ownership here. That's one of the reasons I'm proud and excited to be a part of the team here in order to further the mayor's vision and help at actual. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jerrah. And I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. I'm very bad with the syllabic emphasis, so I will get it right.
No problem. We got it. No problem.
Great. And so I see Terri, you're able to join us. So welcome, Terri. She's again the COO of Atlanta Housing Authority. And we're just doing, a brief introduction, and maybe if you could tell us a little bit about, the history and state of Black homeownership here in Atlanta and your connection to the initiative.
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to thank Urban Institute for the awesome opportunity to participate on the panel for a discussion that, quite honestly, is just so important to the sustainability of our communities, and quite honestly, the sustainability of the people within this country as a whole. As Chanel stated, I am the Chief Operating Officer for Atlanta Housing Authority. In Atlanta Housing, you want to keep in mind, as a public housing authority, we are the primary provider of rental assistance. We serve about 26,000 households on an annual basis, but our authority does so much more than just rental assistance. We have a robust homeownership effort, and I'll share some information with you about that, as well as we have approximately about 380 acres of vacant land that really, and this vacant land is the result of former public housing projects that were demolished in order for us to come back in with mixed income communities. And so we have a huge opportunity to add to the community development infrastructure here at the city of Atlanta. When I think about just home ownership in Atlanta as a whole, I actually revert back to my previous role, which was serving in the Department of Planning and Community Development, and then of course ultimately becoming the city's chief housing officer. Home ownership is critically important. As my colleagues have stated on percentages, Atlanta has about a 44% home ownership rate. And so when you think about that, that means the majority of our residents are actually renters, which nothing is wrong with that. But when we think about home ownership and the opportunity that home ownership creates to really provide generational wealth, we really want to move families more towards home ownership as we can. Here in Atlanta, again, we got about a 44% home ownership rate. When we start thinking about households of color, that rate is actually even less than that. And so what we're finding is that households of color have significant barriers to home ownership opportunity. One, first and foremost, possibly down payment. Other will be financial restraints. And then we're also finding that there's an issue with preservation of home ownership. So if you do have a family that's in home ownership, there is also a concern around preservation. And so the city of Atlanta as a whole really has looked at all the public sector agencies, which Atlanta Housing is a part of, but we have about 5 agencies: Atlanta Housing Authority, Invest Atlanta, which is our economic development arm, the Department of City Planning, which Chanel is a proud member of, as well as the Fulton County City and Land Bank Authority and the Atlanta Redlining. These agencies, from a public sector perspective, are really charged with how do we implement and execute upon the mayor's vision to deliver more housing opportunities. Our mayor, Mayor Andre Dickens, who's in his 101st day today, has a very ambitious goal of 20,000 units across over his 2 terms, which would constitute 8 years. When we think about the 20,000 units, it's so much more than just producing housing, but it's really how do we produce that housing in an equitable fashion so that we can make sure that all families, all persons have an opportunity to participate in quality housing as well as quality opportunities. Thinking through not just from a production aspect, it also looks at preservation of existing homeownership opportunities. Two initiatives we have here in Atlanta will be the anti-tax displacement program, really focusing in on how can we eliminate the burden that's created by gentrifying neighborhoods with the improvements and really eliminate that tax burden that those families are facing. And then second to that will be the community land trust. The community land trust model is one that we have found to be a very critical model in gentrifying neighborhoods and communities, but also with some of our seniors when in trying to preserve the opportunity for homeownership where property taxes may very well exceed the cost of the mortgage, or quite honestly, some may not even have a mortgage, but the property taxes exceed it. So again, looking very much to be a part of this discussion today to talk through some of the strategies we've used here in Atlanta, but also to learn from each one of my colleagues from different cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terri, and I'm glad you previewed some of these issues that we're going to talk about in a little while, especially about barriers and also land trust, because I'm particularly interested in that as a new board member for the Atlanta Land Trust, so learning as much as I can. So I want to welcome Sharon again. Hey, Sharon, how's it going?
Hey, great. So thank you again. And again, thank you to the Urban Institute for hosting this conversation, which is critically important. So very briefly, my name is Sharon Park, and I'm the founder of a consulting firm that focuses exclusively on creating practical and implementable solutions to the affordable housing inventory crisis that we face. One of the projects that I'd worked on in partnership with the National Community Stabilization Trust, or known as NCST, is a loan fund called the Developing Affordable Starter Homes Fund, or DASH, that is focused on the city of Baltimore. And I currently serve as the executive director of DASH. So many of you on this call are very familiar with NCST. They are very focused on two major priorities: putting vacant properties back into productive use, and also making sure that there are adequate supplies of move-in ready homes for homeowners. So we combine forces, so to say, with the city of Baltimore, some very important funders, including the Neighborhood Impact Investment Fund of Baltimore City, as well as very generous philanthropic sponsors, PNC and Rockefeller Foundation, to create this loan fund, which is really geared towards supporting the very hard and critical work that small developers, and when I say small developers, I mean really individuals, do to fix blighted or distressed assets within Baltimore City's communities to create affordable homeownership opportunities. So you asked the question about Baltimore specifically and some of the challenges that Baltimore faces on this issue. In terms of the landscape of Black and brown homeownership, there was a report done, I think in conjunction perhaps with the Urban Institute's report in 2020, that showed basically when things were booming between the Great Recession and later in 2017, 2018, the homeownership rate in the city unfortunately fell to about 47%. And more kind of drastically, the Black homeownership rate sank to about 42% from around 45%, which I think 42% was probably slightly lower than the national average. So the odd thing about that was that, notwithstanding all of this, Baltimore had probably the largest number of distressed homes in any major city in the United States. So for us, in terms of trying to solve for one of the major issues that we think, which we'll talk about later, is one of the big challenges, is really the shortage of affordable homes. We thought we need to put together a capital fund that could support people who do this really hard work. The mayor mentioned that, nonprofits do a lot of great work in this sector to create supply, but he also talked about the capacity issue. So our view is that we really need to expand the capacity of not only nonprofit developers, but also private developers who are doing this really critical work. So that's how I got involved, with this effort that's specifically focused on the supply side of the equation, which I think is a really critical piece of the puzzle that we're trying to solve for.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sharon. So I am excited to jump in. And I think that, one of the ways, there's so much that we can talk about, and we're going to talk about tools and obstacles, but there's almost like an ideological question that I have for y'all to start off with. And that is, why is increasing Black homeownership important to your organization? And that question is obviously what are the specific benefits that you can attribute to homeownership that accrue to Black homeowners? But if there's anything else that you think is wrapped up in that, I'd love to hear about it as well. So why don't we start with you again, Jerrah? Did I say it right this time?
You absolutely did.
Okay, great.
Great job. Great job. Great
Thanks.
job. All right. So thank you for the question. So, we know historically homeownership is important as it helps build wealth, for both current and future generations. It also helps, particularly in cities like Newark, combat involuntary displacement, it's caused by gentrification. And it also combats blight and contributes tremendously to the beautification of neighborhoods, right? In terms of stabilizing our communities as great places to live and grow up and work and quality of life. So it also contributes particularly to our aim to recover equitably in terms of our economic development. And homeownership really is a sign or an indicator of a community's economic health. And so, so much so that here in Newark, I mentioned that the overwhelming percentage of Newark residents are renters as opposed to homeowners. But for us, it's so critically important to increase the homeownership rate that we actually, again, identified it as a goal, a very specific one. And so, because of that, we're looking to, as we identify goals and lay them out, we want to make sure that we can measure them, measure our progress, and also to help us inform, how to better pursue home ownership and provide that as an opportunity for our residents. And so, in terms of quantities, we're looking to support 1,500 new homeowners, low moderate income homeowners by 2026, and also help support 200 existing homeowners. And so again, we're very intentional about home ownership within our goals as we grow as a city, as we improve our overall quality of life, and really help establish wealth in our work to become a more vibrant city.
Mm-hmm.
It's critically important here in Newark, New Jersey.
Thank you, Jerrah. That's great. And I love that you made that connection about, the benefits don't just accrue to the homeowner, they're accruing to the community as a whole, to the city as a whole. That makes total sense. So Terri, would you like to take a stab at this one as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Jerrah, and I hope I pronounced that correctly as well, really hit the critical point. When you think back to just overall neighborhood and community stabilization, homeownership is a strong tool from a community development aspect. I want to make it a little personal though, and I just think about homeownership and the impact it had on my family, as well as myself growing up. My mother was only able to afford a home. I'm from a small town in Louisiana, and my mother was only able to afford a home through an old Farmers Home Administration loan. And when I became, I think I was around maybe 10 or 11, was the first opportunity I was able to see my mom actually experience homeownership. And for my family, it was really a stabilization and a sense of pride that was instilled within me and my siblings, because we had our own place to call home. We had a decent place to call home. And also from a financial aspect, it really increased the opportunity for wealth building for my mother, and quite honestly, for generations to come. And so I think when you think about Atlanta is probably one of the highest cities when it comes to just really poor economic disparity among our families, right? We have very low economic mobility among our residents. Home ownership, much like it was done for my family, can be used as a tool to help elevate the opportunity to build wealth for our families. And so I think the economics of it really, quite honestly, is one of the most important arguments that can be made. I do believe that in any city you have to have a healthy balance of home ownership and rental. and renters. It has to be a healthy balance. But homeownership not only builds generational wealth for a family, it also builds the tax base of a city. And when you think about the tax base of the city being built, you also start thinking about schools. And because we all know that schools are really funded by property taxes. And so when we think about the overall health of our communities, homeownership is a really key trigger and a trigger to help increase the overall economic health of our communities.
Great points. Thank you, Terri. Sharon, do you want to tell us a little bit about how this initiative works for you?
Sure. And I echo the comments of my fellow panelists regarding the importance of homeownership. I mean, we talk about the importance of homeownership for wealth creation, intergenerational wealth creation. But even if you put kind of the wealth piece aside, owning a home is really a way of forced savings. And so Terri touched on kind of, personal aspect of that. For me, my parents immigrated from Korea. One of the first things they did when they immigrated was really to try to buy a home. And as extended family immigrated later, decades later, the similar message was, one of the best things you can try to do is buy a home, have a home and try to have healthcare. And so when you look back over kind of the decades of, my parents paying a mortgage, my aunts and uncles paying a mortgage, my aunts and uncles were lower moderate income households, worked in factories, worked in, basically frontline type jobs. What happened over decades of paying your mortgage and basically kind of a forced savings is when their house was paid off and they were near retirement age, they had a lump sum of cash. So regardless of whether there's a debate as to wealth creation, given the volatility that we've seen over the last 15 years in house prices, I think the data supports that homeownership is a very good way to accumulate assets. And asset accumulation is very important for a variety of reasons. But on the wealth accumulation side, I think the Fed puts out some pretty good data, which is also very shocking, that an average homeowner's net worth is about 45 times that of a renter's net worth. And even more disturbing is that the median net worth of, I think like 25 or 26-year-olds and older who are working Black households is literally about 1/10 that of similarly situated white households. So for me, the dire need to promote and sustain successful homeownership among BIPOC communities is really because of the community stabilization that it provides, the wealth or asset accumulation that it provides. I think it is the best way that the data supports it, to really bridge the race and income inequities that we all talk about, meeting after meeting and conference after conference. So for me, this effort that I'm so grateful to NCST to be sponsoring with respect to the DASH Fund is how do we actually move the needle to try to solve one part of the equation in doing this, which, right now in this point in time, to me is at all-time crisis levels, which is just the lack of inventory. For so long we focus, and it's important to focus on the mortgage side, the demand side, but if there's nothing to buy, down payment assistance and availability of mortgage credit doesn't do a lower moderate income household much good. They need to have a good quality, affordable home to buy. And we need to unpack the ecosystem of how that comes to bear. And when you really drill down from a capacity standpoint, the nonprofits who do a wonderful job like New Jersey Community Capital and CAPC can't do it all. So we had to figure out a way to deliver capital resources, support, subsidy to all the people involved in this ecosystem. And that's why we're hoping that DASH, in terms of a loan fund that will provide flexible, fair capital, as well as technical assistance to small developers in Baltimore City, can be part of that solution.
Thank you, Sharon. And I'm so glad that you kind of took our conversation in this direction, because talking specifically about the housing shortage, which is, I think, affecting, markets in all of our communities is absolutely one of the major barriers that I think we're all seeing in our work. And so that's kind of the question that I have is that, what are some of the big barriers that you're seeing? Obviously inventory, but there are some other that you touched on as well, Sharon, that exist on both the supply side and the buy side as well. So we'd love to hear from you, Jerrah, about those barriers that you're seeing in Newark.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for the question. We've seen problems or barriers to home ownership being some of the traditional ones that for the most part we're aware of, whether it be education, right? Learning exactly how to become a homeowner, but also being able to remain a homeowner, as well as access to capital and income. And so, we have partnerships that are extremely important here in terms of helping educating residents to become property owners, in addition to providing capital. And I'll talk about some of those programs and some of those interventions. The mayor said for a long time that the problems that we face are not new, right? They're longstanding, and they're persistent, and they're pervasive. So although we appreciate a lot of the most recent research that has been published, because it tells us what some of the nuances are, helps us refine and hone our approaches and our responses to those challenges. But ultimately the question is, what are we going to do about it? And so, again, beginning with the education piece, in terms of helping residents understand that, homeownership is called the American dream, right? Because it's a lofty goal, right? And it's one that's fundamentally important in terms of, again, wealth creation, economic stability, and also quality of life. And so, it's extremely important for our residents to have access to those types of supports, education and information. And the way in which we've been able to begin to provide that is through partnerships with organizations, mayor named Urban League, there's NACA, there are several others here in the city that are doing their part as part of, again, a larger, more comprehensive approach to some of the challenges, right? Because we know that education is not enough. I mentioned the funding, right? So, down payment assistance, in some instances, assisting folks with their financial habits in terms of budgeting. Understanding the responsibilities of home ownership and being able to save in anticipation of some of the things that a landlord will no longer be covering, right? Because now you own that property. And so taking a look in terms of lowering the entry, the barriers to entry in terms of home ownership, but also helping ensure that folks are able to sustain those properties. We know that some of the data and the research shows us that typically low income homeowners, first-time home buyers, tend to struggle within their first few years. A lot of times the experience of home ownership, if we go in unprepared and not with enough information and ongoing supports, then we tend to see, unfortunately, those homeowners are most vulnerable when the economy turns or when external forces impact communities. Most often, at a much more disproportionate rate for our folks of color and low income residents than others. And so, we see those persistent barriers, and so certainly looking forward to discussing exactly what we're doing in order to combat that here in the city of Newark.
Absolutely. And I tried to break it up so that we could talk about barriers first in this question, then about solutions in the next question, but it's so hard to kind of take those things apart, right? And even to talk about, what I hear you saying too is the that y'all are faced with both the demand side and the supply side problems, and trying as a government entity to address both of those things.
Yeah. So yeah, so if this is an opportunity for me to kind of jump in and talk about like what we're doing about it, because again,
Okay, and you talk about solutions now, and that way we'll push the other two questions together for you, Terri, and Sharon as well. So yeah, go for it.
All right, thanks. As long as it's good with the panel. So again, the main question is, what are we going to do about the problems? We're clear on what they are, and so we've come up with a number of specific interventions, as you will. We know that there's no one answer. We know that whatever solutions we develop have to be comprehensive, right? We have to have a toolbox, if you will, as the problems are persistent and longstanding. And so, the mayor talked about the land bank on a macro level, but again, when we're talking about specifically targeting folks of color, Black and Hispanic populations, low income, and we really have to be intentional about how we craft those solutions. So within the land bank, right, because we said one of the ways to help promote home ownership is to lower the cost of land. We have specific programs. So one is move-in ready, right? So these are first-time home buyers, low income, who will be moving into a renovated home. Whereas, we also have the Resident Advantage home ownership program. And these are specifically for Newark residents in order to buy some of this Newark owned property. Of course, he mentioned the Housing Choice Voucher, or formerly more properly known as a Section 8 home ownership program. But in addition to that, we also have the Live Newark program. So the Live Newark program provides, again, one of the things I think was education. That's a barrier, but another thing is actually being able to afford it. And so this program provides either down payment assistance or funds toward closing costs for low income Newark residents. And so we also talked about, again, the challenge of upkeep and the importance of beautification and combating blight in our neighborhoods. So there are also funds for current homeowners in order to make repairs to their homes, as well as we talk about the overall quality of life and our recovery. And so, like, these are just some of the tools that we use explicitly through also the land bank and also directly through the city in order to be able to help our residents achieve the dream of home ownership. So I could certainly get into a little bit more detail regarding those, but I'll certainly yield to my fellow panelists for their responses.
Thank you, Jerrah. Yeah, I know there's so much there. Terri, I'm like, where to start? There's so much going on, but yeah, could you talk a little bit about the barriers that we see here in Atlanta and maybe some of the programs that we're implementing? And there's a whole bunch of questions here in the chat, and I'll just mention it briefly in case you are able to touch on it in any of your responses. But some of the questions are, homeownership as a wealth building tool is really dependent on the rise and the appreciation of the home itself, which is in turn caused by gentrification, which is, a very complex issue to unpack. So just want to put that out there so that we're kind of thinking about it as well. And then, of course, Jerrah, you had mentioned how, some of your tools to do home rehab, I think, are part of stabilizing, ensuring that legacy homeownership can continue. And that was also another question. If we do have programs that we can talk about, Terri, that are focused, more specifically on helping Black homeownership sustain itself once it's in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, again, when I'm thinking about just this panel, the discussion, and some of the things that have been said by my fellow panelists, what really strikes me is a conversation I had probably about 2 or 3 years ago. I was in a room and a consultant had a map, and he had a map on the projector screen. And that map showed all 50 states. All 50 states within the United States of America. And his question was, which state or which city within a state has solved the affordable housing issue in this country? And there was and the answer was not one state, right? So when we talk about affordable housing, housing affordability, attainable housing, however you want to frame it, it's a problem. And it's a problem not just from a home ownership perspective, but also from a rental perspective. Today, we're dealing with the home ownership side. And so when I think about the challenges and the barriers for home ownership, quite honestly, what we've seen here in the Atlanta market really is access to down payment assistance, right? Access to down payment assistance, the financial restraints that some of our households who may be mortgage ready faced because while they may have income support of mortgage, they may not be the credit readiness may not necessarily be there, right? Also, just overall education. We're also finding in our market that when consumers are going to apply for mortgage loans, some lenders, not all, but some lenders may not necessarily share information about down payment assistance programs, because we know the majority of down payment assistance programs are subsidized by public agencies, and they can be a little cumbersome to layer those down payment assistance programs. On the supply side, the Federal Reserve Bank released in March that Atlanta is now an unaffordable city. Well, some of our residents will say we've been unaffordable for quite some time, but now that we officially have gained that title, the question is the supply side, is it there for our residents that are able to qualify for mortgage and mortgage ready? Who are they competing with? And they're competing with investors. Just last year, we saw 43% of our inventory for sale that was gobbled up by investors because they have ready access to cash and they're able to close on a transaction quicker than some of our BIPOC households. And so those are just challenges. We also have a challenge when it comes to the construction market. So if you think about right now, Atlanta probably have a 1 month supply of for sale houses, 1 month. Now, we know in healthy housing markets, literally you need about 6 to 7 months of housing supply. This whole condition has actually been exacerbated by the pandemic because the supply definitely is not meeting the demand and is squeezing our BIPOC households out of the opportunity. We also don't have as many construction starts as we've had in past years. We've seen construction starts really dwindle since the foreclosure crisis. And quite honestly, the supply of those construction starts are not necessarily BIPOC, nonprofit housing developers or for-profit developers that would cater to certain communities or certain aspects of our communities. And so there are different problems all the way around, from the supply side, from quite honestly the production side and who's actually doing the production, but also just from the financial capacity and ability. And so when I think about what are we doing about it, the first thing I would say, and I hope this resonates, is that this cannot be solved by government or a government-affiliated agency. It absolutely cannot. There has to be a cross-collaborative effort. And I will tell you here in Atlanta, our residents hold us 100% accountable to really talk about affordable housing, but more so than talk about it, to do something about it. Over our last 2 mayoral elections, affordable housing was such a critical part of the conversation that it literally galvanized a collective effort among public sector, private sector, nonprofit, and philanthropic organizations to really come together to think through in a very intentional fashion as to what strategies can we put together for affordable housing. I'm proud to say that as a public housing authority, we've been at the table every step of the way. When I think through just sort of some of the steps that we're taking, we have an initiative called the Atlanta Collaborative. And the Atlanta Collaborative was actually funded by Wells Fargo. And I want to take this time just to thank Urban Institute, because we've been in these conversations with Urban Institute really over the last year or so regarding homeownership and what things can we do to create more homeownership opportunities for our most vulnerable residents. But the Wells Fargo Worth Initiative actually funded a housing planning grant through the Community Foundation of Greater Atlanta as to how we could create a collective implementation strategy to really increase BIPOC household homeownership here within the city of Atlanta and the metropolitan area. We've put forth an execution strategy where we believe, if funded, we believe we could create about 6,000 opportunities for homeownership, 5,000 new, and about 1,000 from a preservation aspect. Thinking about all the barriers, but taking those barriers and making them opportunities to really help our families. One, how do we coordinate and streamline the down payment assistance programs that are offered through the different public entities? I spoke earlier about Atlanta Housing having a down payment assistance program. We quite honestly have impacted over 1,000 households over the last 5 years. And in impacting those 1,000 households, about 89% of our recipients have been households of color. And so that's huge, but how do we now leverage that work that we're doing on the housing authority side with our economic development agency to make sure that we can uplift even more homeownership? Second will be, how do we create more access to capital? And that's capital from a construction standpoint, but also subsidy that could feed more home ownership. Again, at Atlanta Housing, we've increased our home ownership allocation over the last 2 years because we recognize it as a vital tool. And quite honestly, we really worked to graduate our families from our Housing Choice Voucher Program to home ownership opportunities and being able to take advantage of down payment assistance. The third effort that we're looking at through the collaborative, and of course with Atlanta Housing as a partner, is how do we mobilize the opportunity we have for development on vacant land? I spoke earlier about Atlanta Housing having probably about 300 or so parcels, but there are other public entities that have vacant land that we can literally capitalize for housing opportunities, with a great portion of that being home ownership to help stabilize our communities. And then the last thing I'll say is our mayor announced an initiative, which I think is going to be huge in addressing affordable housing and home ownership in our city through the faith-based community. And this initiative is really working with the faith-based community and understanding what resources they have from a land perspective that could then be mobilized to help create affordable housing opportunities. Because again, the supply is just not there to meet the demand. And our families are fighting so hard against investors. Quite honestly, they're fighting sometimes against lending institutions. And they're fighting against just beating that barrier or obstacle of having down payment assistance available to help them have the opportunity for home ownership.
Thank you so much, Terri. I'm intimately familiar with some of this work as we carry it out in our office. So especially around the faith base and the increase of activation for vacant land, because that's work that Terri started in our office that we are continuing. So thank you for being a leader on that. So we're down to about 9 minutes left in this panel, and I know that Sharon is working very specifically on this increasing capacity on the supply side through providing capitalization to, so I'd love to hear about that a little bit. And then there's also this like parallel side though, Sharon, I don't know if you can touch on it, if you have thoughts around, you know, we focus a lot on like, let's increase supply, let's get folks into homes. But I think there's this other side that folks in the chat are very interested about, which is how do we keep people in homes? So if you have any thoughts there as well, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, so Terri said a lot and I echo everything she says. She really kind of covered the gamut, but specifically with respect to the Dash Fund and what we're trying to do, you know, one of the biggest barriers to creation of supply is capital for small developers. And again, when I say small developers, I'm talking about literally individuals who do renovation and rehabilitation of assets, specifically in Baltimore City, for example. One of the biggest challenges in Baltimore is just the sheer number of vacant homes. The commissioner of the Department of Housing and Community Development recently estimated there are probably 15,000 vacant homes in Baltimore City, and the city only has control of probably over 2,000 of them. So, you know, when you think about what are the capital challenges besides just access to capital, which is what the Dash Fund is trying to promote among small developers, it's also the subsidy piece that people have touched upon. So regardless of whether it's a private developer or a nonprofit developer, one fundamental challenge is always going to be the value gap or the appraisal gap between what it costs to renovate or rehabilitate a home or new construction versus what an LMI household can either afford or what the fair market value might be. So initiatives like NHIA that one of our former panelists mentioned, that NCST, Chris Siglin and STST is spearheading, is a very important part of the solution as well in terms of the subsidy from the construction side or the supply side, you know, to increase, you know, that availability. In terms of, you know, the sheer number of sources of subsidy, I think, you know, this is where government really, you know, comes into play, but I think it's very difficult because there are multiple sources and developers are often kind of caught in between trying to, you know, fend for themselves. So one of the things that we're hoping for Dash to do, in addition to provide loan financing, is to be able to be a thought leader with respect to aggregation of subsidy on the construction side to basically get these homes built. So I think that from a solution standpoint, that's something that's extremely important that I hope people on this, you know, call will really think about in terms of how can we aggregate sources of subsidy, you know, for the supply side, subsidy on the demand side in terms of down payment assistance, et cetera, is really important as well. The other thing that we're really thinking about at Dash is also the sustainability as a successful homeowner or borrower once someone gets into the home, which I think is also a topic that, I'm really happy to hear people start talking about, because, one of the things that our goals of Dash in terms of the good quality affordable home ownership opportunities is, we know, and the data shows that one thing that will certainly derail a consumer as a mortgagee or a borrower is some unanticipated capital expenditure. And that can often happen with homes that have been renovated or rehabilitated because of a lack of quality assurance or quality controls. We call it kind of the lipstick on a pig syndrome. So I think one of the things that we also want to focus on in partnership with organizations that do this, quite frankly, as their specialty, is from the education side, from the how to be a successful homeowner and borrower side. We want to make sure that those resources are in place for folks. We also think it's really important from the financing side for lenders and sources of capital for successful maintenance of one's home to think about how do we provide capital to people to be a successful homeowner. And maybe there's a way we can do soft second mortgages or figure out other sources of financing that are going to really cover major capital expenditures, for which, if the consumer can't get financing, will likely lead to the vicious cycle of the deterioration of their asset, perhaps falling behind on mortgage payments, et cetera. So those are the types of things that I think we as a community need to be thinking about. It's not just getting people in the home, it's keeping them in the home from a sustainability standpoint, because that is part of the forward wealth or asset accumulation. That's part of the goals of home ownership that we've all talked about in terms of the benefits of that.
Thank you so much, Sharon. And it's great to hear that, the things that you're working on with Dash are universally applicable and things that we can learn from. So in the last 3 minutes, I'm going to kind of throw it out there because I think that this is a topic that wraps up a little bit of what we talked about across a number of different questions here. I want to ask y'all, and I'm just going to put it out there, whoever really wants to respond. I'm going to ask y'all a little bit about land trusts as a tool to preserve, to create and preserve Black home ownership. And the reason why I asked this is because there's a question in the chat about how do we, protect our communities against the types of investor-owned domination, say, for lack of a better word, of the home ownership market. How do we ensure that folks are getting properly educated when they're going through this process? I know that's something that land trusts do, but also how do we ensure that folks have access to generational wealth through home ownership? And I think that's actually an interesting tension with the land trust model, because for those of y'all in the chat or in the room who aren't as familiar with the land trust model, it basically ground leases the land to you, but allows you to purchase the structure. And then of course you are capped on your upside when you sell the home, because you must sell it to another affordable family, but the home is permanently affordable. So it's kind of this balancing of the individual interest and the community interest in that way. So I would love to hear y'all's thoughts on how land trust can or cannot be a solution, and what their limitations or benefits might be in your perspective.
So I'll jump in. I was actually a founding board member of at that time it was called the Atlanta Land Trust Collaborative here within the city of Atlanta. And it really, the ideal itself was really brought to Atlanta by a young lady by the name of Valerie Wilson, who at that time worked with the Beltline Partnership. And the Beltline Partnership, the Beltline itself is a huge redevelopment effort here in the city of Atlanta. And there was a concern several years ago that as the Beltline grew and as redevelopment occurred, that people, and quite honestly, people of color, Black folks, would be forced out of their homes. And so the Atlanta Land Trust really started from the standpoint of how can we preserve and make sure that units that are occupied by homeowners actually have an opportunity and are protected from the gentrification, or quite honestly, the property value rise that we know will take place. And so, here in Atlanta, the land trust, I think, has been a really, really good model, just to see the growth in the land trust model, where it's kind of not necessarily transitioned from the owner-occupied piece but also is understanding how it's important to really focus in on how to create more supply. Has been very, very, very critical in some of our neighborhoods that have been hardest hit by gentrification. And one of the things that we did here in Atlanta, probably maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, is Chanel kind of gave you the diagram of how it works, where the structure itself is what the individual homeowner or participant actually owns. We're here in Georgia, it was not clear within our state law that community land trust homeowners could actually apply for homestead exemption. And so we here at the City of Atlanta went forth with a referendum about 2 years ago so that homeowners could apply for a homestead exemption. And that way, again, they're benefiting from another opportunity of wealth, but they're able to participate in all aspects of homeownership, although they don't own the land. And so I think that model is hugely successful. Our land trust was smart. The board members of our land trust include representatives from the public sector. You have a representative from Atlanta Housing on the board, as well as Invest Atlanta and even the City of Atlanta, which Chanel is representing, but also so many stakeholders in the community that's actually working to promote and build affordable housing. So I'm excited to see the growth of the land trust beyond just the bounds of the Beltline redevelopment area, but really to how we can expand it across the city so that we can ensure homeowners have an opportunity to purchase in areas that, quite honestly, would not necessarily see homeownership by BIPOC households.
Thank you so much for that, Terri. I am so glad we got to, I know I squeezed it in at the end, and I am so sorry because we were at time, and I could talk about this all day, frankly, and I'm sure y'all could too. But I just want to thank our panelists for today so much for your insight. Thank you to our hosts for this. So at this point, we are going to take a 15-minute break, I think, for this session. So if everyone comes back at 1:10, you'll have another panel starting then. But thank you so much, everyone. I look forward to seeing y'all in these types of events in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janelle.
Thank you.